And now on BBC Two, Open Door, the series in which the BBC hands over airtime to the public to use under their own editorial control. Tonight's programme is presented by Imperial College Students' Union.
I think that overseas students play an important part in determining the role of this country overseas and its profitability. I think that the current situation on overseas student fees is a disastrous policy for both the developing countries concerned and for the well-being of this country.
I feel very bitter. I did not think that Britain would do that. Britain was much more consistent in its policies and had regard to foreign students. That was my feeling when I came here. Now I seem to have more and more difficulties, and I feel myself as a scapegoat for quite a few problems.
I have been able to get over, but there are other guys who haven't been able to get over because there's been an increase, right? So the general trend now is towards trying to get your education where you can get for the cheapest possible fees, that kind of thing. So people are now going towards the States. Yeah. I mean, because the fees over there are cheaper than over here.
So there's a definite reduction in the number of students coming here from your country because of the fees?
Yes, there is a definite reduction. There's a definite reduction because of the fees, yes, that's...
There are 70,000 of the world's best students in Britain who come here from abroad simply because they think we can teach them something. But Britain has slammed what was an open door in their faces. Why?
The reason was the same as the reason that had led the last Labour government and Shirley Williams, who was then the minister, to start putting up the fees, which was that the British Treasury was faced with a completely open-ended commitment to the subsidy of overseas students, which it felt it couldn't carry anymore. The numbers, as you probably know, had multiplied by 300% between 1969 and 79. And we were getting to a situation where I think I'm right in saying that more than half of all the postgraduate engineering places in Britain were held by overseas students. And this expansion, unplanned by anybody, had run away with itself, as the Labour government recognised. We therefore thought that the first step was to put a proper economic cost on the courses.
Before the government rethink, an undergraduate from overseas was paying about £705 a year in tuition fees. Then, in 1979, the concept of full-cost fees for overseas students was introduced. The effect has been dramatic. An arts course will now cost at least £2,700. Science and technology courses cost even more, at least £3,600. The most staggering increase of all is in medicine, at least £6,600 per year.
So there you can see a village.
Student numbers are beginning to drop rapidly, which is just what the government wanted. But the question we have to ask ourselves is whether the government has considered what the full cost to Britain may eventually turn out to be. But if, as the government says, that's what it costs to run these courses, why should we care if the numbers of overseas students do drop?
Short answer to that is because we're supposed to be a civilized country. But for those for whom the argument has no moral appeal, I would simply say that there are material reasons, very clinical, definite, profitable material reasons for Britain establishing or re-establishing and maintaining its link with tomorrow's consumer market, with the countries which are the source of most of the world's raw materials, which are the countries that could become the major area of political instability, and that at the same time that Margaret Thatcher was shouting about the Red Menace in Africa, she was ensuring that Zimbabwean students went off to Patrice Lumumba University in Moscow, simply because they couldn't afford to come here to study law or agronomics or biology. And so whether we make the appeal and implement the policy on moral grounds, which I think is sustainable, or whether we do it on straightforward grounds of material self-interest, British self-interest, then in either respect, it's necessary for us to stop the current policy, to reverse it, and to operate on an entirely different basis.
Out of 4,500 students here at Imperial College, 600 are from overseas. 3 years ago, the figure was more than 1,000. The effects of the drop in numbers are beginning to bite.
Well, the effects are very bad now. I mean, if I may describe it in terms of the consequences of the financial cuts, we are at the point when we are having to consider very seriously declaring staff redundant in all categories of staff, everything from professors to cleaners. And if the number of overseas students were to fall much more, it would make that problem very much more serious, even than it is now.
What do you see as the main economic benefits for Britain of having overseas students?
I think there are two kinds of benefits. Firstly, I think there are cultural and political advantages in our having a proportion of students from overseas. They are influenced by the education that we give them, and insofar as we believe, as I believe we should, that British life has something to recommend it, we are to that extent foregoing the opportunities of spreading our culture and our political influence throughout the world. That is one aspect of it, which perhaps applies particularly to the undergraduate students. The other aspect is that we all believe in universities, and I think we mostly believe in industry as well, that students, and especially postgraduate students, who have been brought up to work at the forefront of technological developments especially, go back to their countries wishing and naturally trained to develop what is essentially British technology in their home countries. And that means that they bring us export opportunities and industrial opportunities of all kinds. That, we believe, is being seriously affected.
I have many friends who have actually studied here and gone back and bought British. A friend of mine has finished textiles in Leicester Polytechnic, and he's now currently negotiating a huge machine to take back home, and that is quite a few thousands of pounds. Another friend of mine finished an electrical engineering course in Queen Mary College, and he's now an agent of a British computing company back home.
I don't think it is only the aid side of student fees that are of concern. I think it is the benefits to this country that have not been quantified in present government thinking. Recently, I have come back from a trip overseas where I have visited Singapore, Malaysia, Thailand, Hong Kong, and India. And I can see evidence in those countries that codes of practice established in engineering have been firmly based upon the UK system. I see ex-students of Imperial College in high places in government and industry. We even had one man that was Minister of Environment in Thailand. And these are the people that are making decisions, that are establishing codes of practice, that are of benefit to the UK economy.
The government has chosen to ignore these benefits because they cannot be easily calculated. But everyday experience shows the benefits are not only real, but of vital importance to British industry.
On reduced fees. If you look at Korea or the Philippines, where a lot of the education has been orientated towards the United States, you will see government departments and industries buying predominantly from the United States. If you look at Singapore, if you look at Malaysia and India, where a large amount of design has been carried out by British consultants, you see a tremendous backup to British industry by the recommendations and codes of practice that automatically mean British equipment can be involved in subsequent installations. It therefore follows that if we cease to train the future leaders of many of these overseas countries, in 10 years' time, we are going to lose very significantly in terms of influence and trade.
It's not just the effect that these students have when they go home that benefits Britain. Roughly half of the research in science and engineering is done by postgraduates from overseas. If undergraduate numbers continue to fall because of prohibitively high fees, then there will be fewer overseas students left to undertake the postgraduate work. And there simply aren't enough British students to carry on the present levels of research done in our universities. The sort of work done in this fluid engineering group is typical.
It's experimental, mainly. It involves the measurement of velocity fields in design or industrial equipment. That a lot of industrial equipments need better designing. I can mention things like pollution of the air, better efficiency of internal combustion engines, and also, as I said, the human recirculatory system needs investigation.
The vast majority of the work we do is done under contract to various agencies or companies, and that brings in an overhead to the college. Perhaps the second easiest thing to say is that the college derives benefit from the quality of the work which is done and from the knowledge which is freely available that they help industry.
Why do you think there's such a high proportion of overseas students here?
I don't know the answer to that. What I do know is that when we advertise for staff, either at the graduate student level or at the postdoctoral level, the vast majority of the applicants come from overseas.
What sort of figures are we talking about in the money earned by these students?
Oh, difficult question. Let me say first that I looked at the list of students, graduate students and postdoctoral staff in the fluids section, and around 40 of them, and perhaps 2/3 to 3/4 come from overseas. If I take the total amount of money which accrues to the college, then I can only do it roughly, but it's many hundreds of thousands of pounds.
In the end, the government's policy all comes down to money. But how do you draw up a balance sheet? No one seems able to agree on what the total income derived from research is, or how much 70,000 students spend in just living here, or most difficult of all, what the long-term benefits of generating exports and extending British influence abroad are. The government has neatly solved the problem by ignoring everything it couldn't put a price on. The issue is more than simply a question of money. Education is perhaps the most effective form of foreign aid, and this shouldn't be left out of the calculation. A cold, wet Nigerian standing in a cold, wet field on a winter's day, measuring the amount of water in the soil. He's here because Britain has something to offer, high technology and expert training, which will be more than academic when he returns to the hot, dry conditions at home. This is the link between the Third World and Britain, which the full cost fees have endangered. Some courses are of particular relevance to the Third World as well as Britain. To keep these courses available to British students, Third World students are often needed to make the courses financially viable. And if we let them disappear, they won't be available to anyone, anywhere. A good example of this is the nematology course run by Imperial College. Dr. Adrian Evans explains.
Nematology is the study of plant parasitic nematodes which cause disease in plants. The extent of the problem is worldwide. In the tropical regions, almost every crop is damaged, in particular by the root knot nematode, on a whole range of crops, including citrus, vegetable crops, tomatoes, tobacco, and so on. Agriculture is fundamental to many of the third world countries, and we have the problem of teaching them the details of work with plant parasitic nematodes, their primary interest is in food, in controlling the nematodes which damage the crops at the peasant farmer level. But then for generating overseas revenue, income, you find that many of the major crops that they earn revenue from are severely affected by these plant parasitic nematodes, and in many cases total crop loss is possible.
You're from Portugal, though. Why are you studying here in Britain?
Well, I'm studying here because we have many nematode problems in Portugal. Pheasants need advice, and the only place where this course is offered is in Imperial course, an nematology course.
What's your government's attitude to Britain charging such high fees for courses like this one?
Well, the government now is discouraging students to come to Britain because the fees are very high. And
so your government can't afford to send many students to Britain?
Yes, well, they are sending less students than before.
How have the high fees affected you personally?
Personally, I had very great difficulty to get my full fees to come. I just got half of the fees, and after being here, I applied for some more institutions for British Council. Namely, well, the answer was not very encouraging, but I think I will get the fees anyway.
This map shows the numbers of British students that we've had, and the fact that there are a number of other countries which we've traditionally drawn from, which are principally countries of the old Commonwealth, like India, East Africa, Southern Africa, and West Africa. And now we find that many of these are amongst the very poorest of countries, so that now it's only applicants that we're getting from oil-rich countries, and particularly in South America, that many of our applications are coming from. So effectively, we're removing the chance of educating these countries in many of the poorer regions of the world in favour of people who can afford to pay for the course.
How's Britain benefiting overseas in terms of cultural and political influence from the students on the course?
Quite a lot, I think. It's quite surprising how many of the students that we've had on our one small course, with as few as 5 to 10 students from abroad on the course, in terms of the effect that they are able to have once they get home. One of our former students is now Director of Crop Protection in the Agricultural University in Malaya. Another one has recently become the head of the Crop Protection Department in the newly emerging country of Zimbabwe. And yet a third student is now the Minister for Manpower Planning in Zimbabwe.
What effect have the increase in overseas student fees and the cuts had on student numbers on the course?
Well, it's been rather catastrophic, whereas in previous years we could expect applications to run at anything from 10 to 20, in exceptional years up to 30 from people abroad. We're now down to numbers in the tens, and of those, the numbers who can actually get money to come on the course after we've been through all the regular qualifications procedure is very few. At the present time, we only have 2 students from abroad actually on the course.
Well, if this course weren't run in Britain, where else would they be likely to go?
The places that teach plant nematology elsewhere are very few and far between. This course is now probably unique in Europe, certainly, and in the world. I would not hesitate to say that a course which has a similar breadth of training would be very difficult to find.
We are in danger of 2 things. Firstly, in turning its back on foreign students through prohibitive fees, Parliament is effectively squeezing out of our higher education system the very people who in the future would have been looking to Britain for an industrial ally. Secondly, and just as important, Britain's political and cultural influence is diminished. We are losing friends and not even saving money for it. the Department of Education and Science has seen a 20% drop in overseas students in just 2 years since they introduced the full cost fees policy. What effect do they see on our international relations with the countries who relied on us in the past? The Minister responsible for higher education, William Waldegrave.
Some have relied on our tertiary education system, and that is indeed why the Foreign Office has been trying to aim funds specifically at them. The most intense row, I suppose, has been with Malaysia, which has some tertiary education, and of course we've got involved there with a row which is not only about student fees, it's also about dawn raids on the stock exchange and a number of other issues. But I wouldn't want to say that this hasn't caused problems with Malaysia. It has, and I've been told by the Foreign Office so in no uncertain terms.
Well, aside from the economic and international relation arguments, what about the fact that numbers of overseas students help to keep over very specialised scientific courses, which wouldn't be viable economically because of the low number of home students?
Well, where that is so, and there can be cases where it's so, the UGC is trying to move in terms of its distribution of recurrent funds to meet some of those problems. The other side of the coin is this: when very large British funds were put into the Three Sisters, Imperial, UMIS, Strathclyde, in the 50s and 60s, to be the leading edge of technological training in this country, I don't think anybody conceived at that time that the net result was going to be that those great colleges became as dependent as they did on overseas students. In a sense, instead of acting as a drag on, to drag out of the British educational system a much higher level of technological training in the schools, the suction worked to bring in overseas students. Now, that in itself is quite a good thing. But we do want to try and, I mean, I think the British taxpayer in the 50s and 60s was assuming that the great majority of students going to those colleges were going to be British.
So price discrimination was the answer. Obviously, this hits hard at those with the least money, but the government has attempted to redress the balance.
We have moved to try and shift the policy towards direct support of those countries where we think there is an aid priority. £45 million roughly has gone via Foreign Office policies into government-to-government and Commonwealth scholarship schemes, which are going to be bringing in this year about 5,000 Commonwealth and Third World students to this country.
One man in no doubt about the value of overseas students is Neil Kinnock, opposition education spokesman, who once described Britain as being in danger of becoming a higher education Hilton.
I think it was the most graphic way available of describing how theoretically everyone is free to come to Britain to undertake higher education, but that because of the imposition of very high full cost fees, that the right in fact is limited to people of very substantial private means, in the same way that anyone can walk into the Hilton Hotel on Park Lane, but actually to stay there you've got to be very rich.
What do you see as the flaws in the present government's purely economic argument to save money in the short term?
Oh, they're huge flaws. They're commercial flaws, they're political flaws, they're diplomatic flaws. The most important flaw, I think, is an educational one, both in terms of the way in which the opportunity and provision of higher education has been effectively removed from deserving people all over the world, and the impact that that has then had upon the financing of our own higher educational institutions, making several courses, very important courses, too expensive to run, and having a major impact on home students. So there is no economic or moral justification, either domestic or international, no political justification for what the government has done.
Well, why do you think they've done it then?
They did it initially because they were presented with this fairly easy opportunity, as they thought, for saving £100 million. In practice, of course, they will lose money by it. And even then, they wouldn't have undertaken that method of trying to save some money were it not for the fact that they knew that they could mobilize certain prejudice against foreign students, especially black students. And so they had a political environment in which they could operate, and a simplistic, superficial way of saving £100 million. And that's why they went for it. They didn't pay any attention, as was obvious in all of their comments and reactions, to the educational, commercial, political, economic, or moral implications.
What about the Conservative argument that they are successfully looking after the interests of poorer students by offering scholarships?
That isn't the impression in the third world, and it isn't the truth either. The one scheme that they have to support postgraduates is extremely limited, and in any case, what it means is making provision for those who, by their excellence in their initial degree, could probably command access to research just about anywhere in the world. And then, as far as the undergraduates are concerned, the system that they have of scholarships suffers from all the limitations of very narrow scholarships, in that it is much more a test of educational background than of educational potential. And if you look at the third world, who manifests their educational background best? Why? Those who have had the best treatment. Who have had the best treatment? Why? Those who are the best of. They're exceptions, I mean genius exceptions, but they are such a minuscule minority as to render the scholarship system ineffectual in terms of compensating effectively for the full cost fee system, which is the system endured by the overwhelming majority of students who would want to come here.
Gordon Quarty is from Ghana and is one of a large number of overseas students doing research in this country. He is currently chairman of the Overseas Students Committee at Imperial College.
I think the long-term effects are potentially quite serious because people come here not only to be educated and do their degrees, but they also come to make friends and contacts to help them in their various fields when they go back to their countries.
How is this policy going to affect student numbers?
There are 3 groups of overseas students. The first group are people who can afford to pay the fees irrespective of their level, and I think that group will remain constant. Then there's a second group of people who are sponsored by their governments and by companies over here, and I think that group will drop, the numbers in that group will drop and then eventually level off. And then lastly, there's the group of people who are seriously affected by the increase in fees, and I think that group may eventually disappear altogether.
Would you say that the group you're talking about that may disappear are the ones most in need of the education?
Yes, and even in this college, I think you can already start to see that the numbers of people in that group are decreasing very rapidly.
And they're going to go on decreasing. Cheaper courses in American and Canadian universities are steadily luring away students who would traditionally have come to Britain. Even more radically, some students are now beginning to go beyond the English-speaking world to the Eastern Bloc countries. Whatever influence Britain would have had on these people in a rapidly changing world will be lost. The present government's policies ignored the incalculable benefits to Britain simply because they are incalculable, and chosen instead to save a modest sum within one government department, a mere 2% of this year's higher and further education budget. Unless we change course soon, it may be too late to put right the damage we are doing. It's time to look again at the full cost. Would you have come to Britain if the fees had been at the present levels when you first came?
Certainly not. I would go to America or Canada.
Essentially, people want to be educated, and they will go to other places which may be less financially expensive, and they will establish their contacts over there.
What do you think the government should do then?
I think the government should think about reducing the fees because they're going to lose out in the long term.
A final word from an elder statesman.
You are aware that a multitude of scholars from diverse parts, as well from this side of the sea as from overseas, meets at our town of Cambridge for study, which we hold a very gratifying and desirable thing, since no small benefit and glory accrues therefrom to our whole realm. Unless you conduct yourselves with more restraint and moderation towards them, they will be driven by your exactions to leave your town, and abandoning their studies, leave the country, which we by no means desire.
Henry III speaking in 1231.